Hi, this is David Friedman. I'm with TCA Crossroads, and I'm with my co-host, Dave Burkus. TCA Crossroads is where entrepreneurs and investors connect. And we have a great opportunity to talk to an investor today. How are you doing, Dave?
I am doing great, David. I'm glad you asked. And we do have a great guest today, and that means we ought to just jump in. So I hope you're doing well, but I'm not even going to let you talk. Let's just go hear our guests.
All right, so I'm going to bring on Carey Ransom. Hi, Carey. How are you?
I'm great, David. And Dave, good to see you as well. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Tell us a
Good.
little
Well,
about yourself. I know you're an entrepreneur and you're a partner of a venture studio called Operate, but tell us, what is that and how does that fit into our topic of ecosystem?
Sure. So I have been in Orange County now for over 20 years, mostly, and most of that time as a serial entrepreneur, have been involved in a whole bunch of startups here as a founder, co-founder, early executive investor, and also have gotten involved and invested in a number of startups around here. About 5 years ago, a partner of mine and I started Operate as really a jumping off point for early stage founders. And we tried to find a number of local Orange County based founders to build it around. And we started shortly before COVID. And once COVID hit, we actually expanded it and were able to work virtually with founders all over the place. So we now have about 30 companies that we've been either involved with to found, co-found, first investor, help put together syndicates. We've played multiple roles in the early stages of those companies to really help get them off the ground. And as you guys know well, as early angel investors, the failure rate of these kinds of startups is extremely high. We always look at it as, if we can get involved, maybe we can take the failure rate down from 90% to something less than that, with hopefully improving the odds or unfair advantage that we can try to bring them. And it's been a ton of fun. We have some really exciting companies that are growing quickly and have really made it to some of that escape velocity. And in addition to that, my partner and I co-founded a company a couple of years ago that he's now running full-time as the CEO. And I also helped found and run a separate strategic investment fund called Bank Tech Ventures, which is comprised of just over 100 community banks all over the country who are our LPs, who look to us to go identify the emerging technologies that can make their banks better and find those, make small investments in those, and then bring them to the banks to get the technology and business benefit from. So I'm involved in a few things that keep me fairly busy and on the road quite a bit as well these days.
That's impressive. Okay, so I got a big question for you.
Absolutely.
A venture studio particularly, and then the other bank endeavor, what added value is your group giving that helps to reduce the number of failures?
Well, Dave, that's a fantastic question. We don't add any value except for just our good looks. And no, I'm just, so that's honestly why I got into this. Is I'm a builder. I'm a doer. I grew up in a family business. It was a 100-year-old retail family business. And so from a young age, I always had this sort of ingrained training in me from my dad and my grandfather. Part of it was never ask anyone to do anything you wouldn't be willing to do yourself.
Right.
And I look at that very similarly as an investor in companies. And in many cases, my instinct, which I think is very different, I don't know that I'm a particularly great investor from the academic side. I think of myself as a roll up my sleeves and do type of person. And so I look for ways that I can very proactively help in any particular way that I've maybe experienced before. I've had every job in a startup multiple times. And so the thing that I've become good at in my career is finding great talent to do any of those jobs far better than I can. And what that also has helped me do is scale companies, give work away, be pretty low ego and certainly not territorial, And often it's freed me up to go work on the bigger, thornier problems that often founders are the best equipped to go attack. And so through Operate, I really look at our value add in many cases as taking on some of the thornier challenges that maybe the founder doesn't have time to address at that moment because they're stretched in one place or another. Or in many cases, we've taken on this set of work that I call non-strategic but necessary. And if you ignore it, you might ignore it to your peril, like doing accounting or making sure your legal contracts are done well, but you may not get credit because you need to be building the product or selling customers or doing the things that actually are central to the expertise you're trying to deliver to the world in a new and better way. So we can partner with people in ways where maybe we see things that they may just not see because the number of times that they have built companies is generally far fewer than we have. And so that's where we try to be those additional hands and feet or eyes and ears that they just may not be able to afford at that really early stage. So that's, central to how I am wired, how I think, and how we try to partner as really, and why it's called Operate, because we do work, we're operators. And I think bank tech has similarly adopted a lot of those principles. It's just in a very focused way in that we have over 100 banks that are very interested in the companies that we identify. And we know for each of those banks where they're likely to play in the adoption curve of new solutions, new technologies. And so we try to do that matchmaking at the appropriate time. If that company only has a couple banks, there aren't a lot of banks that want to work with that early stage of a company, but we know the few who will. We also work with those companies to improve their third-party risk and vendor due diligence packages. So when they show up to the bank, they don't get asked a bunch of questions they don't know the answer to. They've already been put through that rigor and diligence, so they're ready and much more rigorous in their ability to work with the bank, and they know what they're signing themselves up for. So those are places where we tend to add value to both sides of the ecosystem that we're really trying to help facilitate.
So 2 questions. Number 1, how long
Sure.
have you been at this? And number 2, is BankTech one of the companies in the venture studio or a completely different operation?
Yeah, great. It's a separate operation altogether. So I sort of have these days left hand, right hand activities that I balance my time among. And generally speaking, they don't interact with each other. Occasionally, I'll find a company or an entrepreneur who's so early that maybe they're best suited to start in the venture studio. And we may have a way for them to eventually cross over to bank tech. But Operate, we take a very broad sort of founder first, problem first. So we say at Operate, we're looking for founders we can love, working on problems we can get excited about, where we feel like by getting involved, we can help them de-risk it or increase the probability of success. That can be pretty broad. And we have things, generally they have a heavy software and data foundation to them, but it can be fairly broad as far as industries and vertical markets that they are in. There is a decent amount of financial technology in there, but not all of those will actually cross over and be specifically relevant to banking. The banking opportunity was one that presented itself a few years ago, and my founder partners in that really needed my skill set to help round out what they were trying to do. I have 2 guys that run 2 of the more creative, progressive community banks in the country as partners. I also have the biggest advocacy organization for community banking in the country called the Independent Community Bankers of America, who's a partner. And they needed that entrepreneur, really kind of venture type investor to help round them out. And that's the role that I've played, as well as building the team to help execute on that strategy.
Well, with those partners, you have an unfair advantage, but that's very good.
I do. That's what I always look for whenever possible.
So come back to the question of how long have you been doing this? And then there's a follow-up.
Sure. So Operate, we started in 2019. So we're about 5 years in. And Bank Tech, we started in 2021. So I'm about 3 years into that.
Too soon for any of the companies to blossom or be acquired or anything of the kind?
We've had one company in Operate that actually got acquired after about a year by a pre-IPO company. And instead of taking the cash, we actually converted our ownership into shares in that company. Company's called Gusto, multi-billion-dollar payroll company that should IPO once the market becomes a little bit more friendly to IPOs. And so that was a pretty early success. We have a number of other companies that have gone on to raise follow-on capital. We have one of our companies that Operate that when we invested was doing a couple $1 million in revenue. They're now at about a $50 million run rate. And so I would say they have certainly blossomed
Hallelujah.
as to where they are. So we feel pretty good about the portfolio of companies. As I said, we have about 30, and there's some really interesting ones that a handful are starting to break out. And on the Bank Tech side, amazingly, we've made 20 investments there so far over the last 2.5 years. We have, I think, 5 that have been marked up through follow-on investments, and we have one that has actually already distributed back many times our investment in cash back to the fund, and we've been able to return that to our investors. So as you know well, Dave, it's easy to put money to work. The biggest mark is, can you return capital? And so our banks have been very pleased at the idea that we've already been able to give back almost 15% of the first fund with more expected. And so we feel pretty good that we're on the right track with the kinds of companies and really in that fund, the majority of what we look for as an indicator is that our banks are working with the companies and are getting value from them, because that's what they're primarily looking for, is that R&D strategic value. The financial return is really a second order impact that they're looking for. And thus far, we seem to be delivering on both of those. And that's what's been really fun and exciting about it.
I think it's cool about what Operate does, but I want to see, really have the audience listen to where Operate fits into this bigger ecosystem, because what
Sure.
I'd like to see is your take on the ecosystem, where you fit in. You mentioned partners before. Who are the other partners? How do you use them? And I'd like to explore how we can be a better ecosystem to compete with the likes of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, so as you guys know, I've been in Orange County for 20 years, and I've been an entrepreneur in the county for that entire time in a lot of different forms, and have spent a tremendous amount of time with various folks here. And there's some amazing people trying to contribute to this startup ecosystem. And I think the model that I really like is there's a book that came out about 4 years ago called The Startup Community Way. And I don't know if you guys have read that. It was a follow-on that Brad Feld co-wrote with a guy named Ian Hathaway. And I'll come to that in a minute. But to me, that is probably the best framework for how to think about the key types of capital that you need in a vibrant ecosystem. And I think in Orange County, it's not as well understood that all of those pieces need to be a part and really work together to create the kind of ecosystem that you see in Silicon Valley, or you see in somewhere like Boulder. That was, I think, a key part of Brad's background for how he came to really identify what he felt like was needed for a vibrant startup community. So I felt like Operate needed to exist because there were far too many founders or aspiring founders in this area who didn't have somebody to go to first. There were a lot of people that wanted to potentially get involved once they were underway, but there weren't a lot of folks that were willing to write that first check and
Right.
be that. And we felt like somebody needed to take that on. And that's a role that we have, somewhat to lead by example, signed on to play, hoping that others would do it as well. Because we did not think for a second that Operate could suck all the air out of the room to do that. That to really have a vibrant startup community, you need a lot of those type of folks. And so if I think about Startup Community Way, as I mentioned, I actually did a 2-part series on this a few years ago with Ian, who co-wrote the book. And it was a really fun conversation to delve into more deeply than we will today. But there are 7 types of capital that you need. So you have intellectual capital, people that actually have great ideas. That obviously makes sense. You have human capital, which you need to be able to build beyond the intellectual capital and have people that can do various elements in a business. You obviously need financial capital. You need institutional capital. And I think one of the big gaps, I've analyzed Orange County across all of these areas, and institutional capital, we actually have not had enough anchor organizations to participate. Even the big companies who are here have not leaned in to participate locally in startups. And most of them don't have, as an example, they don't have corporate venture initiatives. And that sort of shows you that they're not thinking about startups from the way that people do in other markets. You need physical capital, you need density, you need infrastructure, places for people to work when they're trying to start a company. Part of Orange County's challenge has been the diffuse nature of it. We don't have the central business district that you might have in a city. We have a bunch of smaller ones. And, people, I think, point to Irvine maybe as the closest we might have, but there really isn't a place everybody goes. You need network capital. You need that relationships and connectedness and, things like party rounds of investment where various groups are coming together. That happens through network. And then the last one is cultural. You need cultural capital. You need the mindset, the behaviors, the attitudes, and you have no shortage of wealth in Orange County. You don't have a lot of people that have made it or participated in startups as a culture. And that has been maybe one of the biggest things that's held Orange County back as a startup ecosystem or community. And so I can delve into all those, but I like those as a group. And I think the biggest thing that we've lacked here is those all really fit in and around entrepreneurs. If you don't have the entrepreneurs who are willing to go out, take the risk, and build a company or try to, that's what all these things really need to ultimately support. And I think we've had a shortage of the type of entrepreneurs that have that gravitational force to just pull people along and then do it again and again and lean into the next generation who need that wisdom and coaching and learning from them to have an increased probability of their success as well.
Props to you for the 7 different types of capital.
These guys built a model that I can certainly buy into and support.
Well, I like the description of it. So the next question is, compare your operation to Y Combinator or 500 Startups or any of the others that have done the same kind of a thing. Tell us how much you invest and all that.
Sure. I mean, we are very subscale when it comes to somebody like that. I mean, Y Combinator is on a level like no other program in the world. And they have had, immense amount of impact on startups globally. And I, nothing critical really to say about them. And I think they demonstrate what is possible and should inspire anyone. I felt like we were trying to fill a small void in this community, and we wanted to do our small part. And so we have invested anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000 out of the gate into the startups that we have gotten involved with. We have as much as $4 million into one company over a series of investments. So we've tried to scale it up. And then in many cases, we've tried to also bring others in to co-invest with us to really demonstrate some of that culture and networked capital that we could try to connect together whenever possible. And so for us, we really called it a studio because to me, studio connotes the creative endeavor of company building, that it is not a factory. And I think a lot of studios or other programs out there take a factory-like approach. They feel like they can manufacture a company. I've done 8 startups in my career, Dave. Every single one of them has been wildly different because of the humans involved, the type of business, the challenges, the opportunities that we faced. All of those I learned a lot from, and there definitely were best practices that I learned through either trial and error or mistakes to say, oh, I don't want to do that again, and learned a ton. I still believe that building companies is more a creative endeavor and bespoke than it is a manufacturing one. And so we felt like studio was the right connotation. Every single one of our companies, we have a different capitalization plan. We have different ownership. We have different involvement. And we're okay with that. We look at it as you bring some creators together and you do the best you can to try to create the best outcome for that one opportunity. And that's what we've done and what we've learned so far. And so I tend to not believe that early stage venture is a scale business. I think it's the opposite. I think it's a non-scale business, and you're better off really believing and operating that way. And that's what we've done. And again, whether we're right or we're wrong, that will ultimately play out over the next several years as some more of these companies mature.
I was going to say, this is a early start of the ecosystem. Angels have moved a little bit up and don't take the risks in the same way that you're describing them. Nice to see you doing this.
Well, I appreciate it. It's been a ton of fun, and I think it probably works the muscles that I most enjoy stressing and working as an entrepreneur.
Let me ask you a question, and then we're going to run out of time, unfortunately, because I think I have just lots of little questions and big questions at the same time. But I'd like your take in the remaining few minutes on how do we build, what's your prescription to build a strong ecosystem to account for the 7 items that you indicate, the 7 different types of capital. And what would you prescribe that we need to do differently? Because Southern Cal has angel groups, we have accelerators, we have universities, we have venture studios, we have a few VCs, not a lot. What would your prescription be for the audience and the listener, and maybe even people who want to get involved as we go forward, so we can kind of rival what we see in Route 128 and up in Silicon Valley and in the Boulder area? So what would your thinking be?
I think you have to really pick spots where you can win. I think part of what makes Southern California so interesting and why I live here is there's vast diversity. You have virtually every industry has presence here. And so on one hand, that's awesome. On the other hand, that creates a very diffuse network. What you see in some of these other markets are much denser networks of talent, of investor, of culture even. And it might seem like you're always talking about the same things with people, but they all are on the same page from a business language. And I think that's helped them. Here, if I look in my neighborhood, there's almost nobody in my neighborhood that works in technology. And so if I were to present them with an opportunity to invest in an early stage company, let's say, they would think I was crazy because they may not understand it. They've never done it before. They're going to go maybe reinvest into another commercial real estate property because that's what they understand. That's what they know. And there isn't enough, I believe, there isn't enough culture and intellectual curiosity, for example, about how do you create economic impact in your local community through the kinds of jobs that these emerging industries and knowledge industries create. And I feel like those are the types of stories that you want to tap people into, to get excited, to feel like they're a part of. And it just has not, I don't feel like that has really matured. And I'm hopeful, for example, that the next generation of wealth that maybe was created in other industries has more of that curiosity to get involved in cooler, more interesting, future-oriented businesses.
Boy, that's a very good summary. Thank you very much for that. Timing is right. David, throwing it over to you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. I mean, I'd like to maybe have you on because I have another 20 questions or so. We can play that game. But I am interested in, in learning more and in trying to figure out, along with Dave Burkus, with you, with our colleagues at TCA Venture Group, with UC Irvine, Pepperdine, all the universities around, how we can build this ecosystem. Because as you were talking, I think you're right. When I ask my friends to invest, they basically say, no, I'm interested in the next safer deal. There is no technology basis versus what's up in the valley, because I lived up there for a couple of years. But let's explore that later on. And maybe the listening audience can provide us with some questions and comments. How do you think, how do the listeners in this audience think about ways to improve the ecosystem such that we can fund better companies, such that we can help grow these companies after funding? It's an interesting question, and I'll leave it like that and wish everybody a very, very good day.